We are in Ephesians chapter 5, verses 1 through 8. And what I want to talk about today is how first century Christians think about love.
Ooh.
Okay. Yeah, they thought about love. Okay. We are in the middle of 5 great statements on how Christians are supposed to live. And the word that Paul keeps using is walk. So he's already said, walk in a manner worthy of your calling. In other words, you represent somebody. Okay, live like it. And what's really interesting is the primary way that we live like it is by how we deal with suffering. That was a couple weeks ago. Then we talked about don't walk like the Gentiles do, the futility of their minds. And there's actually a way of thinking. We talked about that one less than a couple of weeks ago. And now what he says at the beginning of chapter 5 is do walk in love. Specifically, be imitators of God. And what I'm going to say today, that the heart of love for Christians, and I think for God, is this idea of sacrifice. Okay? So before we dive in, though, there's 2 big questions that I want you to think about, and then we'll have like 4 specific points. So here's the 2 big questions. First of all, what does love look like from a Christian definition? There's clearly connections to our sexual behavior in this passage. It mentions sexual immorality, it mentions impurity, it mentions covetousness. The word in Leila's translation was fornication. So clearly there's like a physical, we are talking certainly about physical love, eros. But if you look at it towards the end of the passage, he actually says also, people that do this have no partnership with them. And what he means by partnership is really friendship. He's actually saying like, hey, listen, there's a range here of like, this is part of what this word means, but it also implies how it's not just how we have physical relations with other people, but there is a way that we can deal lovingly with other people. And sometimes dealing lovingly with somebody might mean saying, I can't be partners with you on this thing. Okay? So we want to, there's a semantic range there, in other words. Tertullian, who was an early theologian in the Christian church, think like 200s, 250, let's call it that, actually said this: we Christians share everything with one another, but not our women, not our wives. Okay? Now he's talking about love. We share, that's love, but we don't share. There's also a certain way of loving there. Okay? Simultaneously, that statement, we share everything but not our women, was more progressive and more conservative than both Judaism, very religious, but also than Roman secular culture. In other words, both more conservative and more progressive at the same time. We share everything but not our women. Julian, who was a Roman emperor, who was called the apostate. He was an atheist, and he did not believe in God. He was actually a big fan of pagan gods, the Roman gods. But he complained once, this would be probably 350 AD, about the damnable Galileans are putting us pagans to shame. He's talking about the Christians, and he's saying they're making us pagans look bad. You know why? Because not only do they take care of their poor, they also take care of our poor too. Do you see that? In other words, their love is so expansive and so progressive, it makes us look bad because we don't even love our own people the way they love ours. All right? So, in order to understand, well, let me say it this way. Early Christians were simultaneously freer with their love in some respects, charity and sharing, compassion. But they were also more restrained in their love. Chastity, monogamy, those things actually made sense to them. So in order to understand how first century Christians view something like sexual love, which is being talked about in this passage, we've got to understand how they viewed other kinds of love as well. And that's going to be, this gets us to our second question. So the first question is, what does love look like from a Christian definition? We share all of these things, but not this one thing. All right, the second question is, what's your calculus of how you deal with people? What's the calculus of how you decide who to help or not to help? Who to love or not to love? What's the calculus of how you deal? If we can understand how the early Christians answered that question, that will help us understand how they think about love. So there's 4 groups that we want to think about. Love for strangers, love for friends, love for lovers, love for God. Those 4 things. Love for strangers, love for friends, love for lovers, love for God. All right? That's kind of our outline. So, with that, let's talk about love for strangers. I want you to actually flip to the back of your Bible or to the front of your Bibles. Leviticus chapter 19. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus. I'll bet most of you don't spend much time in Leviticus. Okay? You're like, oh my gosh. You just, Garrett just read through it. Leviticus chapter 19. There is a verse in here, 2 verses that I want you to read. Verse 33 and 34. And I want you to see it on the page. This is worth underlining. When a stranger sojourners with you in your land, you shall not do him wrong. You shall not treat the stranger who sojourns with you as the native, or you shall treat the stranger who sojourns with you as the native among you. You shall love him, hear the love language, as yourself. For you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Okay, have you guys heard that passage before? Yeah. Some of you? All right. We're going to talk about this just a little bit, and I think it'll be helpful. Right off the bat, I want to say this. There are some things in this passage that Christians would say, most Christians would say, no longer apply. Okay? So look at verse 19 of the same chapter, Deuteronomy chapter 19. I'm sorry, Leviticus. Leviticus 19. Look at verse 19. You shall keep my statutes. You shall not let your cattle breed with a different kind. You shall not sow your field with 2 kinds of seed, nor shall you wear a garment of cloth made from 2 kinds of material. So if anybody has like a cotton poly mix. Yeah, okay. Now, so what I want you to see, now listen, do you see that? We're like, that's ridiculous. We don't do that. I don't know any Christians, well, maybe a few, but most Christians would not look at this verse and say, oh, that still applies. If you flip forward a chapter, in chapter 20, there's actually some rules for punishment of sexual immorality that include like capital punishment. I know very few Christians that are calling for us to impose that. So in other words, what I'm getting at, and we just need to be honest about this, there are parts of the Old Testament in this very chapter that we would say don't apply. So why do we look at this passage about strangers and say that it does apply? Do you feel the weight of that question? Now listen, historic Christians had an easy answer for this. They were like, duh, we listened to Jesus and the apostles. And Jesus and the apostles, listen, Leviticus 19, let me read verse 18. I keep letting go of the page. Verse 18, right before the different kinds of seed. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Who else said that? Jesus as like the second great commandment. You love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. That sums up the entire Old Testament. So Christians would say, hey, listen, Jesus said at least something in this chapter is really important. And then you've got the author of Hebrews, chapter 13, where it says, don't neglect to practice hospitality towards strangers. Okay, well, here's a passage on strangers. Okay, Jesus in Matthew chapter 25, remember the sheep-goat passage? Where he says, blessed are you when you saw somebody who was hungry, somebody who was thirsty, or somebody who was a stranger. It's the exact same word here. In other words, the early Christians would go, hey, listen, Jesus says something about neighbors, and Jesus and the apostles together say something about strangers. In fact, what this passage is actually doing, it's doing exactly what Jesus did with his parable of the Good Samaritan. Right after he said, love your neighbor as yourself, one of the guys listening goes, well, who's my neighbor? And he goes, let me tell you. And he tells the story of a Good Samaritan, somebody who's not Jewish. Okay? I think in the Old Testament, this passage is doing the exact same thing. If somebody said, well, who's my neighbor? God is saying, treat the stranger in your midst as if they're a neighbor. Okay? So that's why we as Christians can go back to this passage and say, hey, we know certain parts at least carry forward because Jesus referenced them and the apostles built on it and the early church practiced it. So let's just unpack it a little bit and say, what do we know about strangers? Look at this verse. When a stranger sojourns in your midst, okay, you shall not do him wrong. You shall treat the stranger who sojourns with you as a native among you. You shall love him as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Okay, what's a stranger? There's a word. Sojourners, have you heard that? Sometimes the word pilgrims, but that doesn't quite carry the exiles, expats, sometimes. Expats not quite the right either. Aliens. Immigrants. Foreigners. The closest thing we have in our culture right now would be undocumented immigrants. That is like a very close parallel to what the Old Testament means by strangers. In other words, when famine happens someplace and people can't feed their families, or there's wars, or there's violence, or there's persecution, guess what? Even back then in the Old Testament, people would flee their countries and go someplace else to try to survive. And God is saying to them, when that happens, you need to welcome those people. Okay? In other words, if you say that you love God and you say that you love your neighbor and you don't welcome those people in your midst, you actually don't understand love. Okay? Don't do them wrong. What's the implication of that? Do them right. Okay, well, what does that look like? It's really interesting. If you read through the book of Leviticus, there are expectations of sojourners. Okay, for instance, they're not supposed to work on the Sabbath. Nobody in Israel is. They can't set up their own sacrificial system. They're not supposed to set up a sacrificial worship system to other gods. Okay? They are not supposed to sacrifice their own children on those things. In other words, you had pagan mystery. They're like, hey, this is our country. What'd you say?
What about somebody else's child? Are they? Is that cool?
They can't. No, they can't sacrifice other people's child either.
Okay.
But the point is, so there are some restrictions, right? But what's really interesting is mostly what you get when you read through the Old Testament about strangers and sojourners, aliens, you get provision. They're not expected to become Jews. They're not expected to keep kosher. There's all sorts of things that Jews can't do that strangers and aliens are totally allowed to do. Jews can't eat a dead animal. And then it actually says, but you can sell it to a stranger. They can eat it. It's not a big deal. Okay? They're not expected to go to the temple, although there are some provisions if they want to. Okay? They get full access to cities of refuge. In the Old Testament, there were provisions where if you accidentally killed somebody, like manslaughter, like where it was an accident, you could flee to a city of refuge and they couldn't like come kill you there. You were guaranteed trial. Okay? They got access, theoretically, to an impartial justice system. They got access to fair trade. If you read verses 35 and 36, you shall do no wrong in judgment. You shall sow in measures of length or weight or quantity. In other words, there's not one set of scales for Jews and another set of scales. You're like, I have a pound of, flour to sell. And they're like, oh, it only weighs 3/4 of a pound. Here, we're only going to pay you. You see what I'm saying? Guess what? We use the same scales. We have the same rules, the same laws, the same justice, although there's a bunch of things they don't have to do, particularly that regard to being Jewish. Okay? They get access to resources, grain, olives, okay, grapes. There are passages in the Old Testament that say, when you harvest your fields, don't pick them clean. When you get the olives out of the trees or the grapes off the vines, don't pick them clean. Why not pick them? Don't go back a second time. Leave stuff along the edges. Leave the gleanings in your trees and on your vines so that the strangers and the aliens and the poor and the widows can go and glean. They can collect. They can harvest behind you. Do you see the provision in that? Okay. They've got the right to work, the right to marry, the right to own property, the right to prosper and flourish. In fact, you could say that strangers in the land, immigrants, actually get the opportunity to flourish in the land of milk and honey, just like the Jews, even if they never become Jews. You see how amazing that is? That's pretty compassionate. Okay? Now, where does all this come from? Look at what he says in here. You were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Basically, he's saying this. You want to know why this is? You were strangers once down in Egypt. You were in that position. Okay? You had nothing. I am the Lord your God. This is what I did for you. I provided. Therefore, you go and do likewise. Do you hear the language that we saw in Ephesians? Be imitators of God. Okay. Love for strangers. See that? Second thing. Well, actually, let me say this first. We don't know if ancient Jews actually practiced this very well. We don't have a historical record of this, but we know that the ancient Christians did. They were actually famous for their care for people that weren't their own people. Okay? Because they thought that this is what God is like. So they had a deep love for people who didn't know them. All they had was they were in need. They believed that God moves to rescue, to provide, to share, to bless, so we should too. That's how early Christians looked at love for strangers. Second thing, let's talk about love for friends. Flip forward in the New Testament to Matthew chapter 5, verses 43 to 46. Olivia, you want to read this for me?
Yeah.
Matthew chapter 5, verses 43 to 46.
You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. He causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that?
And then read.
Oh, 348?
Read
Okay.
48. Sorry.
And if you greet only your brothers, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect.
Okay. This is a really famous passage. I know that it's talking about love for enemies. Okay? You should do that. But what I want to focus on is it actually shows us something about love for friends as well. If you look at verse 46, it says, if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do that? He's basically saying, look, even irreligious people love one another in a certain situation when you get love back. Okay? Look at verse 47. If you greet only your brothers. Okay? He's like, even Gentiles do this. And what he's getting at here, I think, is that most of us assemble friend circles with people who can do something for us. We tend to pick our friends. We want people who are beautiful or popular or fun to be around because we want to be beautiful, popular, fun to be around. In other words, we get something when those people want to be around us. Some people like to choose friends who are successful because maybe it will help them be successful, like connections. Some people choose friends who think like they do because when somebody has the same values, the same politics, the same opinions, guess what it does? It reinforces in your mind that the rest of the world is insane and you're not, and you're okay. Okay? In other words, at the heart of most human friendships, I think there's this thing which I would call a quid pro quo. Do you know what that means? We build our friend circles around people who can do something for us. We know that for them to be our friends, they're probably going to want something in return. And so friendship for most people is something of a balancing act. It's a give and take. I'm going to be expected to give certain things like time, affection, attention, laugh at their jokes, hang out with them. But I'm going to get something back in return. And what we do is we tend to evaluate our friendships and go, as long as a person's not too costly, I will continue to be. But when their life goes to shit, and all of a sudden you're trying to help somebody that's really, really struggling, how many of you know people that are like, it was just too much, and they give up on those friendships because it's too costly? What Jesus is getting at, I think, is that if friendship demands more than it gives, we tend to move on. And Jesus is prescribing a whole new way of loving friends that's not based on whether they love you, or come from the same tribe. Instead, it's about sharing, blessing, regardless of if they share or bless back to you. Jesus prescribes this because this is what the Father is like. Do these things. This is how you're going to be perfect, the way your Father in heaven is perfect. Okay? When you do these things, okay, you become sons of the Father who is in heaven. A person who lives this way, well, Jesus prescribes, this is what the Father is like. He sends sun and rain on both the evil and the just. He loves his enemies. He wants to see them flip. You see what I'm saying? If you loved your friends without expecting anything in return, you actually could love your enemies. Because you would already be used to loving somebody with not getting things back. And Jesus is calling for that kind of love. Enemies are never going to give you quid pro quo. Not the kind you want. And he's going, I actually want you to learn to love this way, which is why it's so important that you learn how to love people you don't like, that aren't going to give you anything back. They're going to take more than they give. He's like, I want you to be that kind of friend to people. Okay? I'll say this. A person who lives this way, friends with anyone who needs it, always does what's best for that person, even if it means telling them truth that they might not want to hear. If you are that kind of friend, most people will want you to be their friend because you'll have an incredible capacity to give, but also to tell truth. And most people deep down know they need truth, okay? So, friends with strangers, love for strangers, love for friends. Now let's talk about Ephesians chapter 5. Love for lovers. Remember what Tertullian said, we Christians share everything, but not our wives, not our women. Why would Christians be so progressive in love towards strangers and friends, but so conservative or even regressive towards physical love, eros? The Bible is not anti-sex or anti-pleasure. Go read the Song of Solomon. Okay. Now, the New Testament is pretty hard-nosed about sex outside of marriage. The Christians embraced Jewish sexual norms, but they went even deeper. For instance, Jesus says, if you embrace lustful intent, Matthew chapter 5, it's just as bad as if you'd actually cheat. In other words, if you just imagine what it would be like to cheat or to have sex with somebody, he says, just kind of indulging in that, it's not the same as being tempted, but kind of indulging in that thought. He's like, that's just as bad as if you actually went and did it. That is a really strong standard, further than Jews, okay? Paul says, keep the marriage bed pure. No sex outside of marriage, but in marriage, sexual generosity, but only with one spouse. Do you see how Christianity narrows a little more explicitly what Judaism kind of allowed, multiple wives? Both men and women had sexual rights in Christian marriages. It was extremely countercultural. In other words, the culture didn't think this way. And yet Gentile women and slaves converted in droves. And we should go, why? In our culture, I'm going to tell you why I think why. Do you hear the logic here? We had something that was both more conservative than any other system culturally. And yet people are going, in spite of that, I want to get in. And it actually made sense to them. And I want to try to help you think about why. So I think in our culture, we tend to treat sex as a consumer good. What do I mean by that? It's transactional, and it's based primarily on consent. If you have consent, both parties, everything's fine. Whatever you want to do, it's okay. No big deal. All right? But in first century Christian culture, they actually started viewing sex as a covenantal good. It was something that, instead of being transactional and consent-based, it was actually sacramental, and it involved sacrifice. In other words, if you really want to understand love, it's not how much you feel something, it's how much you're willing to give up for somebody, to forgo. So in sex as a consumer good, what is required? Well, proximity, desire, consent. You don't have to be married. You don't have to share bank accounts. Why not try it out at first? People who do this generally are always kind of looking for an upgrade, keeping their options open. They tend to be living protectively, always making sure that there's an escape hatch. Why would I make a commitment until I'm really, really, really sure? And as a result, they're actually rarely achieving intimacy, okay? Or it's very fleeting. Now let me explain what I mean by that. And this will get into how you view sex as a covenantal good. When you get naked with somebody sexually, it is very, very vulnerable. You're completely exposed. Okay? Now listen, Christians said, why wouldn't you also be willing to be equally vulnerable in every aspect of life together? So financial vulnerability. What's mine is yours is mine. Okay? Emotional vulnerability. I'm actually going to let you know what I'm thinking and feeling. It's not just physical. Okay? How many of you know people that are sexually intimate with one another, but they don't share finances, they don't share debt, and they complain about how the other person's emotionally unavailable. And Christians said, the whole thing's a package deal. I shouldn't actually be one kind of vulnerability until I am ready to be vulnerable in every single area, even about the future. We don't know what's going to happen, but you know what? Till death do us part, for better or worse, I'm going to bet everything on this one relationship from here to the end of my life. And what they said is, when you have that kind of vulnerability in every single aspect of your life, guess what? You actually experience security and intimacy and a kind of relationship that you don't experience otherwise. So the early Christians were like big about, you should not have to get into a relationship just to pay the bills or for financial security. The early church took care of people that chose not to be in those kind of relationships. But they also said, when you get into that kind of covenantal relationship, it is dynamite, or it can be, because you actually have vulnerability in every aspect of your life, which leads to greater intimacy, and you've got resources to help you work through difficulties. It's called a church. Okay? Early Christians said, if I'm not willing to be available in every area, I need to be willing to put off the physical area. Now, do you see how chastity might have made sense in that it was actually really protective of the other person. I don't want you to get attached. I don't want you to get hurt. Okay? I actually want to hold back until we are ready mutually to make this very deep covenantal commitment in every aspect of our life. That is deeply respectful. Okay? And then when they did marry, why did monogamy, sexual generosity within the marriage, why did those things make sense when you share every inch of your being, for better or worse? That gives security and intimacy. So at the heart of sex as a consumer good, I think you've got appetite, desire, and really bare consent. But at the heart of sex as a covenantal good, you've got what's best for the other person, what am I willing to sacrifice and forgo until we have deep alignment, full commitment, full sharing. Do you see how that might actually make sense to people who had been in all sorts of, let's just call it transactional, power-based, sex-oriented approaches? There's a reason why people got into early Christianity and said, I'll sign up for this. This is way better than anything else I'm experiencing out there in the world. I think that still holds true today. Okay, 2 questions, and then we kind of get to the last point. The first question is this: what if God actually loves this way? Covenantal versus consumer. What I mean by that, what if God actually says, listen, I am willing to share, I am willing to bless strangers, friends, but I am not going to make myself intimate with somebody until they're actually willing to open every part of their life up to me. Okay? Just ask yourself, what if the Christian perspective on sex is not because Christians are prude, but actually because this is how God works? And just think, how many people do you know who are like, God feels distant to me? Maybe you're approaching God with a consumer attitude about this and other things. And maybe what we should be doing is, in other words, what if the reason God feels distant is that we are still not really embracing him from a covenantal perspective where everything we have is his? As opposed to saying, like, listen, I'll give you this part, but this, and this, those are mine. So that's the first question. That would explain why God feels distant to so many Americans, and actually to so many American Christians, because we tend to think like our culture on this and not like first century Christians. So that's the first thing. Second thing, in other words, how many of us are approaching God as a quid pro quo? Okay. Second thing, what if you actually wanted to love like this? Where you said, you know what, I'd like to love strangers. I'd like to actually care about people that I don't know anything about. I'd like to actually be able to share with friends, not on a quid pro quo basis, where I could give and give and give, even if they're never going to be able to give it back to me. What if I could actually, outside of marriage, hold myself back, and inside of marriage, give myself more fully? And this is what I'm calling a covenantal kind of approach to really, like, what if you say, I'd like to be like this, okay? How do you actually do that? And this gets us into the love of God, specifically the love of Jesus. So this is the last point. All right, Christianity says you can't just manufacture this kind of love on your own. So it's not enough just to say, okay, guys, go live like this. In other words, even if you get up and go, I'm going to go live like this. 2 Chronicles 16:9, famous verse, says, the eyes of the Lord range to and fro throughout the whole earth, that he might strongly support those whose hearts are fully committed to him. Okay? In other words, God's looking. Any hearts that are fully committed to him, strongly supports. So if you read that passage, you're just like, oh man, I got to have a heart fully committed to him. Do you know, I tried a lot of my life to be like, I am going to have the most committed heart humanly possible. And you get to the point of going, I can't make my heart be committed to God. It's not. And the whole Old Testament is about that. You have hearts of stone instead of hearts of flesh. You need heart surgery. You need a heart transplant. How do you give yourself a heart transplant? You can't. And the Bible says, but God can give you a new heart. Okay? He can put a new heart in you. Your hearts have to be given and your hearts have to be won. What wins hearts? If you start with the idea that all people are basically good, you look around humanity and you think everybody's basically good, I guarantee you that you will probably also conclude that you're better than most. And you'll look around and you'll be like, oh, I see plenty of people that I'm better than. So everybody's good. I'm better than average. Let's call it C+, B-, B+, whatever. Most of you will be like, I'm probably like a B+ or an A-. Okay? You will think that gives you some kind of special proximity to God. You will think he owes you a certain quality of life. Do you hear how transactional this sounds? You will be confused when life doesn't go well or he feels distant. But if you actually start with the idea, and this is what I want you to really take away from this, the idea of stranger. If you start with the idea that you were a stranger, you had nothing going for you. You didn't know God. You weren't seeking God. You were like lost in the land of Egypt. You were in bondage and captivity. Okay? You were a nobody. And yet God came down and had compassion on you simply because he cares about strangers in need. And then you think, God came down and was the kind of friend, okay, that gave and gave and gave and gave. And listen, do you know what Jesus says about friendship? Okay, Jesus doesn't give quid pro quo. Jesus actually gives. If you see Jesus loving people like us, giving himself for people like us, sacrificing his life for us, Jesus says, greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends. 2 Corinthians 5:21 says, God made him who knew no sin to be sin for us. He was incredibly naked and exposed and vulnerable on the cross. He was separated from life so that we might have life. He bore sin so that we might be freed from sin. Like when I start to see, oh my goodness, this is what God has done for me, particularly in Jesus. This is why it says, walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us. He's saying the secret to understanding this kind of love is recognizing this is how you have been loved through Jesus. You were a stranger, he came and found you. Okay? He's got a different kind of operational, like it's not quid pro quo love. It's I will lay down my life for my friend's love. And when you start to believe that he laid down your life for you, my goodness, it becomes a whole lot easier to lay down your life for him and to say, you know what? I really want this thing. But he says to wait, so I'm going to wait. Okay? Now I've got this thing. Okay, and guess what? This relationship's way harder than I ever thought it would be. But he says to stick with it. So you know what? I'm going to stick with it. My point is, the only thing that will get you to that point is when you start to see Jesus doing this for you, and you start to believe that you can trust him, and that he is going to only give you things that are best for you. He's going to tell you the truth even when you don't want to hear it, even about stuff like this. In John 13, actually John 15, he says, actually John 14, if anyone loves me, he'll keep my word. My Father will love him. We will come to him and make our home with him. In other words, what he's saying is when you give yourself fully to me, to Jesus, and you're like, hey, listen, whatever he says, I'm with him. Do you hear how that's like there's no more compartments to your life? And what he's saying is we will actually have intimacy and fellowship. And this thing that I'm talking about, what I want you to see today is what he says about love for stranger and what he says about love for friends and what he says about sexual love. Those are all flowing from the same kind of otherness and sacrificialness. Okay? It's not like, oh, this is really nice over here, but I want a different economy over here in my relationships. It's saying, no, it's all the same thing. Everything is being done for the sake of Jesus, just like everything Jesus does is for the sake of the Father, and it involves sacrifice, and that is a sign of love, but it is so rewarding to sacrifice for people you love and to see it matter to them, and they appreciate it. Okay, so when Jesus says walk in love, that's the kind of stuff he's talking about. All right, super quiet. We'll talk over lunch. Let me pray for us, and then we'll come to the Lord's Supper.